Hey everyone, and welcome back for another deep dive with us. So today we're going to be looking at something that I think a lot of new programmers struggle with, and that is how do you actually go beyond just doing coding tutorials? How do you make that leap to actually being a programmer? We found this really cool blog post from Algo Academy. It's called "Why Just Following Tutorials Won't Make You a Programmer," and I think it has some pretty insightful advice that we can kind of dig into.
Yeah, you see this a lot. People get into programming and they start doing all these tutorials, which is great. I mean, it's a great way to get started, but you can kind of fall into this trap. It's almost like the tutorial trap where you feel like you're learning and making progress, but you're not really building those core skills.
Yeah, that's so true. I know I've definitely fallen into that trap myself. I remember going through a to-do list tutorial. I was feeling so good. I was like, yeah, I built an app. But then when I tried to build something even slightly different on my own, I was like completely lost.
Oh, yeah. That's a classic example. That's the tutorial trap in action.
Hmm?
I think it's because tutorials, they present these like idealized scenarios,
Yeah,
step-by-step instructions, no curveballs. And that's good when you're starting out, but it doesn't really prepare you for, the wild west of real-world programming.
right. So how do we break free from this tutorial trap? The Algo Academy blog post actually has some really interesting suggestions for, how do you move beyond tutorials and start building those real programming skills?
Yeah, one of the biggest things, and they talk about this in the post, is you have to shift from this sort of passive learning into like active problem solving. It's not just about following instructions. It's about like thinking critically, experimenting, figuring things out on your own.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. It's kind of like, I don't know, learning to cook. You can follow a recipe, which is a good place to start, but to become a chef, you need to understand the underlying principles so you can improvise that. Yeah.
Exactly. And one of the most effective ways to do that, they talk about this in the blog post, is building projects from scratch.
Okay, and I can already hear some people saying, but wait, I'm a beginner. I can't just build, some big complex project.
Right. And that's totally fine. You don't need to, build the next Facebook or something right away. They
Yeah.
talk about starting small. The key is to like just pick something small. Think about like maybe a little tool that you wish existed or a modification to an app that you use regularly. Just something small, get your feet wet.
So instead of starting with, I'm going to build the next great social media platform, maybe it's more like, I'm going to build a tool to help me organize my, movie collection or something.
Exactly. And, even if it's something really simple, the process of like designing it, building it, debugging it, running into problems and figuring out how to solve those problems, that's where the real learning happens.
So the blog post, they actually have this really interesting example. They talk about, taking that basic to-do list app, the one you probably built in a tutorial, and like expanding it,
Mm.
making it into a more robust application. Why is that such a good starting point?
Well, you're taking something you already know, you're building on that existing knowledge, and you can just keep adding more complexity. So, for example, they talk about adding persistent storage.
Okay, persistent storage.
Mm.
So in a basic to-do list app, like the one you probably build in a tutorial, your to-do items, they just exist in the browser's memory, right? Which means if you close the tab or you close your browser, they're gone. Poof, they disappear.
Yeah, but in a real to-do list app, I mean, you want those to-dos to actually stick around, right?
Right. You don't want to have to recreate your to-do list every time you open the app. So that's where persistent storage comes in.
Yeah, and that's where you start getting into, learning about databases, or maybe you're using your browser's local storage, and you start getting into concepts like data modeling and how to query data, how to retrieve it. Really important skills for any programmer.
So instead of just working with temporary variables in your code, you're actually thinking about how to like structure and manage data in a more permanent way. That's cool.
Exactly. So now your to-do list is actually useful, right? It's actually remembering your to-dos.
It's actually doing what a to-do list is supposed to do.
That makes sense. Okay, so that's persistent storage. What else do they recommend adding to, beef up this to-do list app?
Well, the next thing they talk about is user authentication.
Ooh, okay. Now, this is where things get a little more complex. You're starting to think about like security and how to protect user data, right? Exactly. So now you're not just building a to-do list, you're building a system that can like securely manage user accounts. So now you're learning about things like how do you hash passwords? How do you handle login sessions? How do you prevent, the bad guys from getting in?
So now it's becoming a much more sophisticated application. and you're learning about, really important concepts that apply to all sorts of software development.
Absolutely. And then they talk about, adding categories. You can categorize your to-dos. You can add priority
That
levels.
sounds like a good way to get really organized, right?
Exactly. And
Yeah.
again, it seems like a small change, but it actually forces you to think about how do you structure that data? How do you filter items? How do you sort them? How do you display all that information to the user in a way that makes sense?
If you're thinking about user experience, making the app intuitive and easy to use,
Yeah.
that's cool.
Right. And then, and this is where things get really interesting. They talk about creating a RESTful API.
Okay, hold on. RESTful API. This might sound a little bit intimidating, especially if you're just getting started with programming.
Yeah, it might sound a little scary, but it's really an important concept.
So what exactly is a RESTful API, and why is it such a big deal?
So a RESTful API, it essentially allows you to separate the front end of your application, what the user sees, from the back end where all the data is stored and processed.
So you're creating these distinct components that can communicate with each other.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And this is what makes your application more modular, it's more flexible. And it also allows you to, create different interfaces for your to-do list. So maybe you have a web app, maybe you have a mobile app, maybe you have a voice assistant integration. They can all talk to the same backend using this RESTful API.
So it's almost like you're building this central hub for your to-do list data that can be accessed and used in all sorts of different ways.
Exactly. So now, you're not just building a simple to-do list, you're creating a system.
This is getting really cool. Okay, what else? What else did they suggest?
One more thing, they talk about adding drag and drop reordering.
Oh, that's a nice touch.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
you could just drag your to-do items around and rearrange them.
Yeah.
It's a good way to prioritize, I guess.
Right. And it might seem like it's just, visual, but it actually forces you to learn about event handling and DOM manipulation and how to update your data in response to, what the user is doing.
So you're taking those front-end skills to another level.
Exactly. And now, think about this. You started with a basic to-do list, and now you've added all this functionality. You've got persistent storage, you've got user authentication, you've got categories, you've got a RESTful API, you've got drag and drop reordering.
I mean, that's a pretty impressive app.
It is. And think about all the things you learned along the way just by taking that basic to-do list and expanding on it.
Yeah, I mean, it's way beyond what you would learn just by doing a tutorial.
Yeah.
And, I think that's the key takeaway here. It's about moving beyond that passive learning and actually taking an active role in, building something real.
Exactly. It's about problem solving and being creative and, really getting your hands dirty with code.
And I think that's a great place to maybe take a quick break. So we're back, and we're talking about how to go beyond just following coding tutorials and actually become a real programmer.
Yeah.
And, one thing that really stuck with me from that Algo Academy blog post was this idea of, developing a growth mindset.
Oh, yeah. The growth mindset. It's super important, especially in programming.
Okay, so for those of us who, might not be familiar with that term, can you break down what it means to have a growth mindset?
Sure. So a growth mindset basically means that you see challenges as opportunities to learn. You understand that you're going to hit roadblocks, you're going to make mistakes. That's part of the process. But you don't let those setbacks, define you.
So instead of getting discouraged and giving up, you kind of reframe those moments of frustration as learning experiences.
Exactly. It's about seeing, effort as the path to mastery. You believe that your abilities, they're not fixed. You can get better through practice and hard work.
So it's not oh, I'm just not good at programming. It's more okay, I'm running into some problems here, but I know that if I keep working at it, if I keep learning, I can get past this.
Right. It's that belief in yourself, and it's really important for programmers because, you're constantly encountering new challenges, new technologies, new ways of doing things.
Yeah, you always got to be learning in this field. There's always something new to learn. And speaking of learning, the blog post, they also talk about consistent practice.
Practice makes perfect.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's what they say. But what does that look like in the context of programming?
Yeah.
What kind of practice are we talking about here?
Well, they talk about, just making it a habit to code regularly, even if it's just, for a little bit each day. Just be consistent.
So it's more about forming that habit than, necessarily having to code for hours and hours every day.
Yeah. It's about keeping those skills sharp, staying engaged with the material. And they also talk about, engaging with other programmers, joining online communities, maybe attending some meetups, stuff like that.
Yeah, I can see how that would be really helpful. Having that community to bounce ideas off of, to ask questions, to learn from other people's experiences. It's like having a support system, right?
Exactly. It's really valuable. So, we've been talking a lot about, abstract concepts and strategies, but the Algo Academy blog post, they have this really concrete example that I think ties everything together. It's the to-do list.
Oh yeah, the to-do list. I think everyone who's ever tried to learn to code, they've probably built a to-do list app.
Ah,
It's like the hello world of web development, right?
it is. It's like the classic, starting point.
Yeah.
But the blog post, they take this basic to-do list and they show how you can, take it to the next level.
So we're talking about that to-do list that we built from a tutorial.
Yeah.
We've got our basic functionality. We can add items. We can check them off. We can delete them. But how do we take it beyond that?
Right. Well, the blog post, they suggest a bunch of enhancements that you can make. And each of those enhancements, it teaches you something, something valuable about real world programming.
So like, what kind of enhancements are we talking about?
So first off, they talk about, adding persistent storage.
Oh yeah, we talked about that earlier. This is like making sure that our to-do items, they actually stick around, right? They're not just disappearing when we close the browser.
Exactly. So this is where you might start learning about using a database, or maybe you're just using your browser's local storage. But either way, you're starting to think about how to manage data.
So it's not just about like writing code that works, in the moment. It's about thinking about how to structure that data, how to make sure it's saved and accessible.
Exactly. And the next thing they talk about is user authentication.
Ooh, okay. So now we're talking about like security, right? Making sure that different users can have their own accounts and manage their own to-do lists.
Right. So now you're getting into like, how do you hash passwords? How do you, securely store that information? How do you manage login sessions?
So it's becoming like a much more secure and like professional application.
It is. And then they talk about, adding categories, so you can categorize your to-dos.
Yeah.
And you can add priority levels.
That sounds like a great way to like stay organized.
Right. But again, it might seem like a small change, but it actually gets you thinking about how to structure your data in a more sophisticated way. How to sort items based on different criteria, how to display that information to the user effectively.
So it's about like thinking about that user experience, making the app more intuitive and easier to use.
Exactly. And then, and this is one of the more challenging ones, but it's really valuable. They talk about creating a RESTful API.
Okay, RESTful API. We talked about this a little bit earlier, but for those of us who are still, kind of fuzzy on what that means,
Yeah.
Can you give us like a quick refresher?
Sure. So a RESTful API, it's basically a way to separate the front end of your application, what the user sees, from the back end where all the data is stored and processed.
So it's almost like building a bridge between those two parts of the application.
Right. And this makes the application more modular, it's more flexible.
Yeah.
And it also allows you to, create different interfaces. So you might have, your web app, but you might also have a mobile app, or maybe you even have, a voice assistant integration. And they can all, communicate with the same backend using this RESTful API.
So you're basically creating this like central hub for your data that can be accessed by all these different things.
Exactly. And the last thing they talk about is adding drag and drop reordering.
Ah, yeah. So you can just like drag your to-do items around and rearrange them. It's a nice touch.
Yeah. It makes the app, more interactive, more user-friendly, but it also gets you thinking about, event handling, DOM manipulation. How do you make those elements on the page, respond to the user's actions?
So you're really taking those like front-end skills to the next level.
Right. So think about this. You started with, this basic to-do list, and now you've added all these features. You've got persistent storage, you've got user authentication, you've got categories, priority levels, a RESTful API, drag and drop reordering. I mean, it's a pretty impressive app.
Yeah. I mean, that's a far cry from the simple little to-do list that we started with.
It is. And it's all just by, taking that basic idea and expanding on it.
And, I think that's a really powerful lesson for anyone who's learning to program. You don't have to start with some like grand, ambitious project. You can start small And you could just, keep building on it, keep learning, keep adding new features.
And as you do that, you're naturally going to run into challenges. You're going to have to, Google things. You're going to have to read documentation. You're going to have to figure things out. And that's where the real learning happens.
It's that active learning that we were talking about earlier, right? It's
Mm.
it's not just about passively absorbing information. It's about like actively engaging with the material.
Exactly. And that's how you make that transition from just following tutorials to actually becoming a programmer.
It really is amazing how you can start with, just a simple to-do list and end up learning so much about programming.
Yeah, it really shows you, how much you can learn when you just, take a project and just kind of run with it.
Yeah. It's the difference between like reading about something and actually doing it right.
Exactly. And the Algo Academy post, they end on this really great note about, the journey of becoming a programmer.
Oh yeah, they talk about, how it's a challenging path,
Yeah.
but it's also really rewarding.
Yeah, and I love that they emphasize that it's not about like reaching some end goal. It's about the process. It's about, continuous growth and discovery.
It's like you're never really done learning.
Right. And that can be, intimidating for some people, but it's also what makes it so exciting. There's always something new to learn. There's always a new challenge to tackle.
And it's important to remember that, every programmer, they started somewhere. Like
Yeah.
we all had to go through that phase of, feeling lost, feeling confused, not knowing where to start.
Oh yeah, absolutely. We all started as beginners. We all had to, struggle through those tutorials, make those mistakes, bang our heads against the wall a few times.
But that's part of the process, right?
Exactly. And the key is to not get discouraged. Use those experiences as motivation to keep learning, keep pushing yourself.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, I mean, what are some like key takeaways that you'd like, our listeners to remember?
Well, I think the biggest takeaway is that, becoming a programmer, it's not about mastering a specific language or a specific framework. It's about developing that mindset. It's about,
Right.
developing that problem-solving ability. It's about that passion for lifelong learning.
It's about like, embracing the challenge, seeking out opportunities to practice, to experiment, to connect with other programmers, build that community.
Exactly. And remember, every line of code you write, every problem you solve, every project you complete, it's taking you one step closer to becoming the programmer that you want to be.
That's a great way to put it. And I think, for anyone out there who's listening and maybe feeling a little bit intimidated by this whole journey, just remember that, take it one step at a time.
Yep.
Don't be afraid to make mistakes, and most importantly, have fun with it.
Yeah, have fun with it. That's really what it's all about.
Well, on that note, I think it's time to wrap things up.
Yeah, it's been great talking about this.
So, to all our listeners out there, thanks for joining us for another deep dive. We'll catch you next time. Heavy.